I've been a part of the steering committee with the town of Wake Forest, what we call the Ailey Young Steering Committee. So a group of us have been responsible for working with Chip Russell, who's in community development, and Michelle Michael, who is the historic preservation lead planner, and we've been kind of giving guidance, a little bit of history, and those kind of things as it guides the further renovation of this house. But let me tell you a little bit about what this house is and what it means and why it is historical and why just history in general is very important, to our community. This house was built in 1875. It was built by Professor Simmons, who was a professor at what was then Wake Forest College. Before they moved, they snuck out in the middle of the night. And it was built by Professor Simmons for rental purposes. It was built really as a piece of rental property. It became known as Simmons Row. So there were in this area, there were several of these houses that were built shortly after the Civil War. And it was part of the whole kind of Reconstruction process that began to take place in the South after the Civil War. And the reason it's important is that it represents how working class people lived and where they lived versus a lot of historical resources and time have been spent identifying and renovating mansions and plantation houses. There's lots of those, but far few examples of houses where people lived, where workers and their families lived, and that kind of thing. And that's the value of maintaining this house. And I think we're very fortunate to be able, in working with the town, to actually preserve this structure and make it a permanent part of our history, where young folks and other folks can come and observe and learn about our history and how we lived post-Civil War. This is also the home of Ailey Young. And Ailey Young is kind of an iconic educator that a lot of people don't know about. Ailey was born in this house in 1875, and he was born to Ailey Young and Henry Young. And Ailey and Henry were the parents of 12 children. Believe it or not, at some point there were 12 children raised in this house. Ailey was the oldest of the 12 children that grew up in this house. In 1899, now obviously this house was rented to the Young family and maybe other families even before then. In 1899, this house was sold by the widow of Professor Simmons, was sold to the Young family. Specifically, it was sold to Ailey Young. This was very rare because back then, women never appeared on deeds and owning things and having ownership of property. This house was deeded to Ailey Young, who's Ailey Young's mother. And so this happened in 1899. Ailey Young passed away in 1910. according to the census. But Henry, who was the father, and some of the children remained residents here for a while later. Okay. Now, in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, this house was fires at this house in both instances, and some of you may remember that. I don't know. Let me look. Nah, you remember. Yeah, you remember. I know. But it caught fire twice, and shortly after then, or a good little while after then, this house remained vacant, and probably was the reason that it caught fire, because it was vacant, and no one was living in it, and the town interceded and secured this property in probably 7, 8, 9 years ago. It was gotta check my notes. Okay, the town identified and secured the property, and at that point we began a process of preservation. Once the town secured the property, it was then the responsibility of the Preservation Commission. The town has a governance body that oversees historic sites and the preservation of historic sites. The town and the Preservation Commission developed a preservation plan. And we've been at this plan for the last few years as it relates to maintaining it and renovating it and making it useful to the community, particularly historical education to the community. And so that's kind of where we've come from. We've gotten grants, various grants that have supported the development, the redevelopment of this property. And we've also gotten dollars from the town, who've been very generous. One of the things I want to say about being involved with the town in historical preservation, I'm also a member of the Wake Forest Historical Association. I'm on that board. And we've done several projects to maintain and preserve historic sites. For example, we kind of oversaw and helped coordinate the preservation of the Friendship Chapel, the old Friendship Chapel Cemetery. Y'all know where that is? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just that was a fascinating project. I learned a lot. I was already close to it, had been a member of Friendship Chapel, but just from a historical perspective, what we found there, and our whole effort was to ensure that nothing happened to that gravesite as development continued at Heritage. And I think with the assistance of the town, we've done that. And it's fascinating, and it's still under development, still not safe to walk through. I've walked through it, and it was a major historical moment for me.
So is it where the former slave bodies?
Yeah. It's just amazing. Some graves are marked, some aren't. But we did, just like we did here, we did an architectural kind of x-ray of the grounds there to find out just how many graves were there. So to make sure that the developers didn't, upset those graves. Here, it was done in order to kind of more of an architectural nature or an archaeology nature, trying to look inside the ground to determine if there were any secrets or stories or material that could allow us to understand how all of this progressed over time. So we've had, a grant from the state. We got an original grant to kind of firm up the foundation. And we've gotten grants to put up signage outside, the interpretive signing, we call it, kind of educational signage. We've got a grant, we've got funding now to kind of hopefully complete this project by replacing the roof and building a chimney and doing all of the other work that needs to be done to make this place a place for education, where young people and old people can visit, and hopefully it will evolve into much more than that. That's the part of this kind of redevelopment and refocus that we haven't worked out yet. Hopefully I'll have a part in it, but that's the next step after over the next year and a half we complete this project. I would hope that the next year when you have your event that there'll be much more to see and you'll hopefully be able to even go inside. I've gone inside and it's a fascinating thing. The historical story of this time, this is called the Saddlebrook model. And it's Saddlebrook because of the way the roof kind of goes from midpoint, like putting a saddle or something. That's what my understanding of it is. There was a central fireplace. When you walk in, there's a central fireplace that goes all the way up the wall, and we're going to restore the fireplace as it was on the outside. And then there were two separate, what they call pens or rooms. One family stayed on one side, the other family stayed on the other side. And then, when I first walked in, I said, how does family stay in just this one room? But in both sides, there's lofts. Believe it or not, I guess where people slept. I don't claim to know that. But so it's identical on either side. One of the things if you start looking at history, it's like a puzzle. One of the things that was really interesting to me was we've spent some time, our last few meetings, trying to determine, we thought, and we do now, I guess, we weren't sure whether there was a front porch or a roof kind of over a front porch. It was kind of a mystery. We think we've solved that mystery. And there was a porch, and there was a little roof over the porch. But it took us a while to figure it out. And we finally figured it out by just asking people in the neighborhood who remember, who might have been friends with some of the families here. This house subsequently was rented by several families. Some of them were in the Young family and some of them were not, but it was ultimately the home of others. Now, those of you who don't know about Ailey Young, again, he was an educator extraordinary. And he and a gentleman, Ailey Young went to Kittrell College and then Shaw University. He was a Shaw grad. So you can't go wrong being a Shaw grad.
Right, your bad.
But he was an educator, and after he finished those colleges, he taught. not in Wake Forest, but probably around the state. And if you remember his two daughters, I sure do, May and Maud Young, and they in essence lived where they ultimately grew up, right down Spring Street. Well, Alan Young and a gentleman named Nathaniel Mitchell, they founded first Spring Street Presbyterian Church, which is not there anymore, but that's where it all began. It was kind of a missionary thing. I don't know exactly who Nathaniel Mitchell was, but I think he was affiliated with some national Presbyterian ministry, okay? Because shortly thereafter, Spring Street Presbyterian Church was developed. They began to have the idea, and they began to look at building a school. There were no schools for African Americans prior to 1900. So in 1905, Alan Young founded the Wake Forest Normal and Industrial School, commonly known today as the Alan Young School. And this was started in 1905. We go a long ways back. At its height, it served both, and it was a residential school also. Students came from all around and from other states. At its height, the school had 200 students and 30 teachers. Okay, and it thrived for quite a while. The school didn't close until 1957, and that's the year that Alan Young died at 82, and the school closed. But a lot of folks that still live in my home here, a lot of folks went to school. It might have been for just a year, or a couple of years. I think that the enrollment there lessened as public schools evolved, and ultimately Du Bois was created. But before then, there was no, and that's what Alan Young benefited from. He did odd jobs with professors at Wake Forest College who saw promise in him. They then began to educate him. And that's how he got on this track of education being his main focus. So that's the story. We're projected to have the renovation and the full preservation completed between now and 2020 at some point. We look forward to it. It's been a real education for me. And let me mention one thing. One of the things, I'm retired now, and one of the things that I've done is use as much of my time as I can to kind of learn what I don't know about my home, where I was born and raised. And there was a lot of stuff that I didn't know that I have learned. And I just urge you, and I mean even Juneteenth, it's just historically based. And I would encourage all of you, especially the young folks, to grow more interested in your history. It's very important to learn about your history. Don't be like me and like my brothers and other people my age, my contemporaries. I hear it all the time, is that, boy, I wish I had asked Mom about this, or I wish I had talked to Grandma about this. I didn't save those pictures and I can't find them. And begin to do that now, and you won't be in a situation like I've been in, where there's just stuff that I don't know, and I don't know where it is because I didn't ask. to encourage you to, walk around. This is the back, and as you can see, this, we've tried to protect it, from further decay by covering the roof, although the storm the other day tore a little piece off. But we tried to make sure that as much as possible is maintained until we get to it. You'll soon have, a sidewalk and a driveway to drive in, and you'll soon see probably a lot of construction going on, a lot of activity.